Video game development, am I right? Seriously though, video game development is complicated. Video game hype, even more so. And when video games show up with unique art or concepts to entice potential buyers, things can quickly get out of hand. I'm talking about Scorn. In case you didn't notice yet, I'm talking about Scorn. Scorn was kickstarted a long time ago. It finally released after much hype, and as it turns out, it's okay or great or trash depending on who you ask. The point is, reception is mixed, which has led to it being classified as a disappointment by a lot of people. But while Scorn is the latest, technically depends subjectively disappointing horror-themed first-person puzzle/shooter game that tries to promote itself based on its unique art style, it is not, funny enough, the only one this seemingly strict, restrictive description applies to. And this is what I'm going to talk about today. First-person horror games of hard-to-define gameplay for one reason or another that disappointed their players when they finally came out. That's our Halloween special for this year. That's my present from me to you. Disappointment! Come on, given the current state of society, don't you think that is very fitting? For our first game, let's not wait around and instead dive right in what you likely want to hear about. Since it was recently released, the H.R. Geiger, is it Geiger? I'm hoping I'm pronouncing this name correctly, inspired, recently released Scorn. Scorn takes place in an undefined place at an undefined time in what seems to be the sometimes bony, sometimes fleshy ruins of a once powerful civilization. You play as the Scorn guy, a guy who wakes up one day and sets off to do stuff. If all of that sounds ridiculously vague, that's because it is. Scorn is a game of few words, and by few words, I mean the menus and the pause screen are the only words that you will see at all. There's not even an alien language to decode or other characters that inhabit the world, it's just an empty void. The void of answers. Which works surprisingly well. The architecture is distinct, very distinct compared to other art styles, and while disturbing at first glance, it can be beautiful in its own intricate way. Especially in its most grandiose moments, whenever you stumble across a large chamber or building made using this weird-ass style. The beginning of the game, when you're just stumbling around, trying to find out where you are and where you have to go, are probably the game's strongest moments, because you see, the game is divided into acts, and each act has a sort of main area in the center that you will go back to repeatedly, as well as a series of rooms that loop around this main area. This pattern is used repeatedly throughout the game, constantly, which means you will always inevitably end back where you began if you just pick a direction and stick with it. Which can be great if you want to get back to where you started, because you need to progress through there, but can also be disorienting as you run around in circles trying to find a new room, which I assume was the intention behind designing the game like this. You'll need to use basic logic not only to solve the many obvious puzzles, but also to figure out where to go next. If you moved some mechanism on the upper levels, then it's time to find some stairs up. If you need to move something on rails, it's time to follow those rails to find the thing, and so on. But as I mentioned before, nowhere this is felt as strongly as in the very first act. The first chapter is honestly amazing. You just see this tower in the middle of this chamber and begin exploring without direction, finding weird device after weird device, activating them only for them to not work due to the lack of a central piece or resource, and knowing that you have to figure out what to do with it, while at the same time kind of nervous of what you're supposed to do with them, since nothing in this game looks nice at all, but knowing that you somehow have to sort this shit out. While the world looks biological, the devices are clearly mechanical, and they imbue the place with a sense of purpose. Like, this isn't just a random temple or bakery. This was an industrial complex made to perform something, a certain task at a large scale, and through solving the first and quite possibly longest and hardest puzzle in the entire game, my arch nemesis from Professor Layton days, a fucking sliding block puzzle, you do eventually figure out what the facility is supposed to do. It was made to crack open egg dudes. Why do we need to crack them open is never explained, but you do recover the aforementioned egg dude and then you carry him around before scalping the dude from the egg violently, killing him while throwing the corpse down a hatch before recovering his severed arm and using it to solve another puzzle. It's useless to ask why the facility was built in such a way and if it is even working properly. The world of Scorn is just brutal by nature, and you end up committing many more atrocities before the end, as well as having them committed against you. If the entire game was like this, fiddling around with machines, trying to figure out what they do and using them to progress, like learning to be the engineer of a lost world in order to achieve some higher purpose, then hell yeah, this would be a really fun game. Problem is though, it's not long before the game completely falls off the edge. You see, about 30% of the way through, the game introduces combat, and combat here is not fun. It is the opposite of fun. It is anti-fun. Shortly before it starts, all you get is a jackhammer melee weapon that takes a long ass time to reload after 2 uses, because yes, it has to reload, and you are thrown against enemies that take 5 hits to die. These enemies can spit acid at long distances, and given the game's penchant for slightly curved, tight hallways, they are mostly unavoidable and will kill you if you try to disengage. Your best bet is to try to find a nearby piece of scenery and try to cheese them by using it. To make matters worse, you not only need to get up close to hammer them in, you also need to ready your weapon, which takes precious time. You can't just ready them as soon as you see an enemy, because aiming makes you incredibly slow, so you have to run, ready the weapon by aiming it, and hope it will hit, because if you are 1 centimeter off the mark, you will get a face full of acid for your trouble. At first I thought, aha! This might actually be on purpose. This is meant to be a survival horror style of combat, and thus I decided to avoid enemies by running as far as I could. But not only this is mostly impossible due to how cramped a lot of spaces are, even in the few times you can avoid them, you can end up getting stuck. Before I unlocked other weapons, I ran past a few enemies into a puzzle room. I solved the puzzle only to find out that I was surrounded by 3 enemies with no way out and almost no health. The game checkpointed me when I solved the puzzle, so I was stuck in an infinite death loop, with the only other option being restarting the act from the very beginning, since the game saves at the start of each act. Given the abundance of puzzles, dead ends, and similar looking corridors I had to pass through in order to get there, I'd rather just stop playing, but I persevered and I did manage eventually to kill the enemies and escape, but I didn't feel the satisfaction of overcoming a hard challenge. I just felt like I cleaned up the mess the devs made when they didn't include proper checkpoints. Eventually, you unlock the pistol, allowing you to engage the enemies at range, and while things got better, they never got fun. The pistol has an incredibly limited ammo supply, and I was frustrated every time I tried to explore and kill enemies only to find a dead end with an ammo supply, but no health recovery, meaning I usually just wasted heals and shot enemies to find ammo that I only wasted because I went there in the first place. At one point, I just chose to die so I could avoid going down that way at all. And luckily, that time, the checkpoint worked properly, in a place where I wasn't stuck on an infinite death loop. But that aside, this is a bit of a problem with Scorn. While the environments beg for exploration, there is no lore or gameplay rewards waiting for you there. Anything that doesn't strictly lead to progression feels, and often is, simply a waste of time and resources. It's amazing that decades ago we had clunky combat in horror games like Silent Hill that still felt better and fairer than Scorn. I would have to replay those games to be completely sure, but I'm going to make an educated guess and say that it's because those games were built around the player movement. So monsters had telegraphed attacks, players had options to avoid or dodge them, and they mostly used melee attacks even when the player had other weapons to work with. Not to mention, while having to reload the last save point is always a bit frustrating, it prevented players from being stuck in an infinite death loop. Simply alternating save files would prevent you from getting stuck without resources. While Scorn doesn't even inform you of when the game saves with a screen icon or anything, something that other games have done for decades. Meanwhile, here we get introduced to long-range projectile monsters that are worse than the big mini-bosses that wander the later areas of the game as the very first enemy. Hell, these later enemies are easier to dodge and avoid than the little ones. The enemy balance here is completely out of whack. And this is why I can't accept this game's subpar combat. Trying to just use, oh, it's a survival horror as a get out of jail free card is just not a thing that works, because trying to excuse it as survival horror brings shame to classic survival horror games, which honestly already suffers way too much from the reputation that they are made bad on purpose. The world our protagonist traverses was not built with his limitations in mind, and while you could make an argument for why this is interesting thematically, I honestly believe this was the result of a group of developers who had a brilliant visual style in mind, but no actual idea of how a game in said world would play out, simply dropping gameplay ideas into it without considering how they fit into the larger picture. As of the time I'm writing this, the Steam store page still describes this game as an open-ended world with different interconnected regions. And in lore, maybe, but in gameplay, let's be honest, this is a completely linear experience. The wording makes me believe at one point this was supposed to be a Myst-like experience, solving puzzles in a bigger sort of open world, but that was scrapped, which is a shame since as a what the hell is that experience, where you slowly figure out how things work, this would have been a much better game. As it stands, unfortunately, I can't recommend this game to everyone. I can't recommend it even to horror fans. I can only recommend it if you really can take a very large dose of anti-fun on your game. But hey, in case you don't want to pick this up, you can still pick up the art book instead. Not only is it fun to look at all of the concept art, but the commentary it gives allows for a much more complete and interesting view of the world without negating all of the mystery. At the end of the day though, I still have to give this game the overall score of disappointing. Now, let's go backwards in time and fly back to the distant year of 2018 to talk about the hellscape Doom Soul simulator Agony. Now, Agony's release was a clusterfuck, to put it mildly. The game was a Kickstarter project that promised to deliver an unflinching, horrifying vision of hell that no AAA studio could ever deliver, with uncompromising brutality and a bunch of other fun descriptors like that, but when it came time to actually release it, the game was censored in order to be able to be published on most platforms and consoles, and it doesn't help that, cut content or not, most people thought the game was just kind of shit. They were eventually able to release an unrated version of the game as free DLC, but following the trail of madness that is Steam reviews and forum posts, it seems this DLC is buggy. Also, there's a separate standalone unrated version that got removed from people's Steam accounts at a certain point, and, well, I didn't really get what the fuck was going on anymore.
What the hell happened here?
Looking at the developer's announcements though, I discovered the official story, which I hope it's true, is that they originally gifted Agony Unrated as a separate product to everyone who owned Agony, but since both games have a different age rating, and some people didn't want their game to come pre-patched with the uncensored content, they had to remove Unrated from everybody's library and instead gave a 95% discount to everybody for the unrated version if they wanted to get it separately. Props to the dev team who managed to deal with this mess while pulling an impressive trick I've seen few times in my life. They patched their game into a better version, not just re-adding cut content, but adding extra content and fixes on top. and still managed to get mixed reviews both times. This also put me in a bit of a pickle as I had no idea if I could show the unrated version on YouTube, so just as a safe measure so I don't have to re-edit this video, I decided to play the censored version just in case. What's confusing though is that people complained about demons having no nipples in the rated version because yeah, it's that kind of game, but this is a pretty nipple-filled game, which makes me wonder if they edited the original game as well. Honestly, trying to figure out what is going on with this game is useless, since they did a complete change on a lot of mechanics and even outright deleted puzzles and sequences from the first build of the game, so it's entirely possible that this review will be outdated by next week. The story of Agony is actually pretty simple and explained in a very pretty and very metal opening, in which you witness the fall of a soul into hell. That soul is our protagonist, and as the narrator explains, hell makes you forget. So he's conveniently amnesiac as well, just to keep ongoing gaming traditions of course. Since he's in hell, it's pretty obvious from the very beginning that he's not exactly an altruistic soul, so the game doesn't even try to hide that he's shady for a plot twist or something. Instead, we are almost immediately sent to find the Red Goddess, an entity which supposedly could hold the key to leaving this place of eternal torment, though it is just as likely she is just another one of hell's torments, put in place to torture sinners with hope for the rest of eternity. From the very beginning, the game's visuals are very striking. They paint a very flashy and fire and brimstone version of hell that is both classic but also has its own little spices as well to make things interesting. Basically, hell is exactly what you would expect hell to look like, but it doesn't feel like a cliche, well-trodden version of it thanks to some creative assembly of parts as well as some magnificent set pieces. I wish I could say the same for the gameplay, but honestly, the tone is set from the very beginning. Your very first task is to jump down a hole and find some hearts to put on a scale to perform a ritual to open the door to hell. You are given a torch to burn down some hellish vegetation, and then the torch is immediately, well, it just goes out for no real reason. And then I got to talk to a guy vaguely about the bullshit I was up to when I was alive, very vaguely because remember, hell makes you forget. So he asks for another torch, so off I go, I find another heart out of 3 hearts according to the UI, and then I die immediately when I go to explore a place that had no indication that it would cause death. Afterwards, I resurrect and jump down the hole again. The vegetation is already burned, so I grab a torch and go talk to the guy and have the entire conversation again, only this time he grabs the torch and proceeds to burn himself, and I go back to the altar with only 2 hearts and that's enough for me to proceed. That's pretty much the entire game. It's never obvious what progress you carry with you when you die, and you can end up stumbling onto the solution for puzzles without even knowing. Also, you can possess new bodies when you die, but you have to get the bag out of their heads first. Remember that if you play it. I didn't know that at first because the game didn't explain it. Okay, so I have so many complaints, things are getting kind of confusing. Let's get back on track. Immediately after that mess of a bugged out puzzle, we are introduced to one of the game's main features and one of the systems I hate the most in gaming, the hiding spots you need to get into because this is a hide and seek game and getting caught means you are immediately killed. Words cannot describe how much I hate horror games like this. Sure, there are fantastic games like Amnesia that did it well and the practice has been going for as long as the hide-and-seek classic Clock Tower, probably even further back, but come on, you gotta use that in some interesting way. Instead, here all you can do is run and hide in piles of corpses or by slipping through cracks in the walls, and you are thrown into a maze filled with the insta-kill demons, while you have to collect 5 pieces of a corpse, like an even more tedious version of Slender. Except, you don't need to, because you can just go to the exit and it's open and there's a cutscene that brings you to the next part of the game. And looking up online, I discovered that it seems that you used to need to do the puzzle in order to unlock the exit of the maze, assuming you can even call that a puzzle. But apparently this is just one of those things that the developers deleted from the game because it sucked too bad. And now it's the perfect time to go into the Destiny lines, which are normally limited, but were unlimited on normal difficulty, which is the one that I chose. There was no easy difficulty, by the way, there's just normal and hard. I picked normal and I had unlimited destiny lines showing me where to go. And then there are also the soul mirrors, which act as checkpoints and when activated spill out body parts, because why not? Everything's gotta be as edgy as possible anyway. They act as respawn points, but the options menu indicated that they were meant to only be possible to be used up to 3 times. I don't know if that's a roguelike thing, where if you die 3 times the game just ends, because they are unlimited by default on normal difficulty as well, which brings me to the point that I'm trying to make on top of this mess. The point that I'm trying to make is that Agony feels like a game that was ambitious to a fault, filled with hardcore challenge, but paired with the game's horrible design decisions, was so frustrating that the developers made it better by simply cutting off content and removing gameplay mechanics entirely. And that's honestly kind of sad and hilarious at the same time. I could go on. If you know me, you know I could go on forever about how the feedback for your actions is utterly shit and how the strange glow that burnable vegetation displays when you're near them with a torch makes it actually harder to tell if they are already burning and to feel if you're actually hitting them with the torch until you get too close to the supposedly burning ones and you get damaged by fire. I could go on about invisible entities that eat at your health on seemingly random places with no indication of what the hell is going on. I could go on about the incomprehensible leveling system in which I find items that give skill points only to not get any skill points but having another indicator that I have no idea what it does, which makes me think maybe this isn't a bug, I just got the other indicator but I have no idea what it does, maybe? Oh, and the sigil puzzles, where you have to guess which nearby drawing to use on a door, if you can even count that as a puzzle. I could go through each point individually for quite some time. But I am exhausted, so I won't. I couldn't bring myself to finish Agony, my life is too precious to waste any more of my time playing this game, and your life is too, so here's my final recommendation. It is a game that is much more fun to watch someone suffer through than to play it for yourself, and a bunch of people have already suffered through it, so go do that. The overall score? Gosh dang it, you have. And now, we go back even further chronologically to the game with the oldest release date of this entire ordeal. A little known deity by the name of Inner Chains. Now, it might be unfair to put this game in the disappointment list because not many people knew about it to hype it up back then, and to this day, not many people know about it either, but I did. Because back then I thought, Scorn is a long way to release, I wonder if there's a weird first-person game that I can play right now, and lo and behold, Inner Chains existed. Unfortunately, it released to a mixed reception and I was expecting something more like BioShock, and it wasn't BioShock, so I shelved it. Also, it is a disappointment because it had a Kickstarter, and damn, I can't imagine giving something like this $100. And because I believed in the project only to get this. As we see, it's not that bad, but well, you see. So, today I decided to go back to it and give it a try and see how it goes. The story of Inner Chains is something. It exists for sure. The game opens with a narrator being incredibly cryptic along with imagery that leads me to believe this takes place in a sort of post-apocalyptic world, but it doesn't look like your average Mad Max or Fallout setting. Instead, the entire world was transformed into a sort of medieval place where malevolent men with masks lead a cult centered around a goddess of some sorts, and they use weird-ass guns that don't look mechanical but are not quite organic either. The protagonist starts are just another mindless cultist, awakening from death in some way I think, but one chance encounter later finds himself branded a heretic and chased through the underground tunnels by the masked man. Now he must punch the shit out of everything and use the weird guns he finds in order to go on an epic journey, or something, that's the best I could figure out. The game has no dialogue, only narration, but in a cool twist, there is a written language that you can see on various murals, and said language is coded with a simple substitution cipher for English, which is a fancy way of saying that each symbol corresponds to a Roman letter, and you can touch tablets throughout the world to learn a letter and have it automatically translated when you reach the Murrows. It's a fun way to reward players who explore the world, since those who search in every nook and cranny are also the most predisposed to want some lore out of it, and it is a way to ensure every dead end isn't simply, well, a meaningless dead end. You might learn a new leather there. Yay! The gameplay itself is pretty simple. You explore in first person this weird tribe in this intro sequence until you fall down a hole, and down said hole you now get a melee attack and you use it to kill some guys until you unlock an electrocution gun, and then you use said gun to shock those guys and finish them off using melee. Of course it gets slightly more complicated than that. Your gun has limited ammunition, and in order to get more you need to get to the HR Geiger machine, because yeah, that's what we're doing today. And the interesting part is, the juice in this machine doesn't only charge your gun, it also recharges your health from the same pool. So if you try to use too much gun, then you don't get enough juice for health. But if you don't use gun and you try to use the game's frankly incredibly bad melee, that doesn't seem to register half the time, then you might end up losing a lot of health anyway. It's an interesting detail that doesn't completely revamp the genre, but it's an interesting wrinkle on the normal FPS loop nonetheless. You also get to use two other guns, a flamethrower which sets enemies on fire of course, and a spike shooter that shoots with ultimate precision at long ranges but deal little damage unless you use it to nail some gnarly headshots for insta-kills. Each of them are also used to deal with all of the various environmental hazards like blade tentacles that you can shock to stun so you can pass next to them. Vegetation can be burnt because of course it can. And the spikes can be used to drop gas balls that grow on the ceiling, that's a kind of a specific one. You can use that both to disarm them so you can safely pass through the area, or to blow up enemies as the gas is flammable. You can also use the spikes to hit insect nests so they will attack nearby enemies, and to nail the backpack of flamethrower enemies to instantly explode them. If all of this sounds very cool and neat, it's because it is. The main character is weak, so you have to use your arsenal not just to traverse the environment, but to activate the traps so you can kill enemies while preserving health and ammo. And to top it all off, this game also has some nice detailed environments. You go through the mechanical bowels of a death factory, to large cathedrals and the enemy quarters, to even forest grave sightings. And when the game gives you a glimpse of grandeur, it is amazing. The scenery is always imposing and oppressive, with the main moving parts being lines of people going to who knows where, giving the impression that they too are just another cog in the machine. So, of course, you'd think this game is the full package, a truly great experience that should be recommended to everyone. But well, not quite, because this game is also deeply flawed. The biggest problem is the lack of polish, and I don't mean just when hands go through objects whenever the main character tries to pick something up, that's fine, but what I mean is with the combat. The melee feels like shit, and my hits feel like they don't connect half the time. The shotgun doesn't seem to stun enemies or organic traps unless you hit them on very specific spots. I always had to hit things repeatedly until I found the specific spot the game wanted me to hit. Some enemies can be headshotted instantly by the spike gun, but others can't. I thought the masked ones were immune to it, which sort of makes sense, but later in the game, even the weaker enemies seem not to die from it instantly, and the list goes on. You also move like a walking simulator protagonist with just a short sprint, and you know, if the game was slow and deliberate and you mostly had to worry about strategy and using the traps in the right order and the correct traps, that would be okay. But then early in the game they lock you into an arena with a door that only opens when you beat everyone, which is weird. And then later in the game they lock you up again, this time with a powerful enemy, but you have to go around while he shoots at you because you're like on the top on a ledge on a sort of higher place, a higher platform, and you need to find some stairs to go down, all while he slowly kills you because you can't just jump down because you die instantly if you fall a couple of meters from fall damage. And that's just... why did you suddenly decide to make your game Doom Eternal if your protagonist does not have a Doom Eternal moveset? And the music, what the hell is up with that? It's mostly ambient and creepy, but then it goes loud and bombastic when you fight, and since it resets every time you engage and disengage enemies, this means it goes from quiet to loud to quiet multiple times in a single minute, and it's just maddening, and it's very unfitting for the dark fantasy tone the game is going for. Later, as you unlock the different guns, you will need different ammo machines to reload your ammo for the different guns, and this translates into you finding a new machine every few steps, so you never really run out of health in the late game unless you're locked in one of the poorly conceived arenas. And then the game ends with a cliche boss battle where you hit the final boss with the proper elemental guns, and then a grandiose finale where the protagonist saves the day at the end of his epic journey, which is okay, I guess. It didn't really feel like an epic journey, and there are points like where the game slows down when the protagonist starts breathing heavily and he starts going slow, and he's sort of, you know, he's anxious about something, like he just revealed a brand new part, a dark mystery in his world. And well, it turns out that I knew so little about the world that was just like, yeah, I guess that looks like it could be fucked up. That looks kind of fucked up actually, but you know, it didn't really hit me because I didn't know the context of what was actually happening. And I could go back with the letters that I collected on my journey to read the lore, but honestly, I doubt that will change too much of how I felt about it. It's probably just gonna be more cryptic bullshit anyway, isn't it? Overall, Inner Chains is a good game with good ideas that make for some interesting game design that needed maybe a little bit more time in the oven, maybe a few more resources, or maybe it needed a lot, I don't know. It's not really a bad game, but it's not a great one either. So for this one, I shall give it the final score of...
Alright.
So it's time for the conclusion. What did we learn today? I think it would be really easy to say that the lesson of the day is prototype your basic gameplay loop before you even think of the rest of the game, and we could act all smug and we could pretend that we are oh so much smarter than the devs, and we could go home and be like, oh, I'm so smart, they should have prototyped the games. But let's be honest, criticizing is very easy compared to actually developing a game, and a simple prototype might not be enough to capture the full scope of what a game can bring. I mean, the main series I talk about in this channel that I deeply love is about doing basically nothing but walking around as a boy during summer vacation. I cannot imagine a gameplay prototype version of that has no backgrounds or sound, that doesn't just feel incredibly boring. The art and music are innate parts of that experience, and it simply does not work without them. So let's get together and try to come up with a more interesting lesson. Here's my take. Here's a very basic take, but what I think could be a little bit more constructive. How about this lesson? When designing a game, don't think just about what makes it special, think about the foundation you are building it upon as well. Basically, it's not just about what makes a game good, it's about what makes a game not bad. It's about what makes it not aggravating. Inner Chains surprisingly ended up being my favorite of this batch, specifically because it did not aggravate me as much as the other ones did. Scorn's opening hour might have had higher peaks than the entirety of Chains, but Chains was overall the most even out experience of the bunch. It's easy to listen to this, especially when I say I'd rather play interesting but flawed games than boring AAA but polished games, that I'm being hypocritical, that all that matters is that the game is interesting, but I think that's a false dichotomy. You can have a flawed game, in the sense that it didn't reach its full potential or had a few mechanics that didn't flow quite well, without having large parts of it or an entire system of it be aggravating to play through. It all depends on what you focus on. It's okay if a character's hands go through a door because you didn't have time to fix all of the animations, but it's not as okay if I receive no feedback or on if I'm hitting the weak spot of a boss. If you have limited time and resources, make sure that the gameplay is not aggravating. Unless that's like the point of the game. In some games, that's kind of the point. But unless you're specifically trying to hit for that point, don't do that. Don't do that, avoid that. The game that is playing on the background right now is a game that I believe does everything that I've been talking about correctly. It is an indie title, it is not the most polished game ever, but given that all you do is mostly walk around and solve the occasional puzzle or two, it certainly feels like it. It certainly feels polished because it does not aggravate the player at any point. It is a smooth experience that you can flow through from beginning to end without feeling a single snag, even when you're sometimes stuck. It is called NaissanceE, and it is a beautiful game that I recommend to everyone. And it brings me to my final point. If you have minimal resources and a beautiful art style, then just make a walking simulator. What are the gamers gonna complain about? That the right step isn't as good as the left one? That's actual advice, by the way. That's actual serious advice. Just make a walking simulator. Anyway, thank you guys for watching this to the very end, and I'll see you guys whenever I make another video. Yeah, I still don't know how to do outros. Just roll the music.